Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October data facing call with welcoming the systems facing track in particular today for a joint discussion on NSPM 33, which is not a type of sun lotion. I quite frankly forget what those letters stand for. But we do have Jacqueline today here to give us a brief overview of what's in NSPM 33. And then afterwards, we will have kind of a shifting discussion. We'll start talking about the data aspects of this memo and move into some of these system aspects of this memo. And really, this is just a discussion day for people to get ideas of how to respond to this and for people to share how they're already responding, because we know that we're all going to have to meet these requirements eventually. All right, so a little bit about us. We are the Campus Research Computing Consortium, and we are somewhere between a community of practice and a professional organization for the research, computing, and data community at large. So there's a lot of folks involved in research data management at libraries, all the way to people who support things like supercomputers and high performance storage on campuses. And we have a number of sections. We have the People Network, which is where we are now. It is kind of a year-round annual conference, a virtual conference, with different topics related to the field. But we also have working groups, interest groups, and operations groups doing making actual deliverables for different things too. And so if you'd like to learn more, our site is carc.org. And just a little bit more about the People Network tracks in particular, right? We have the data facing track, which is who is hosting today, and the systems facing track, which is joining us for this conversation. But there's also emerging centers, which is more smaller or centers that are just starting. There's the researcher facing track, which is all about training, facilitation, outreach. And there's also strategy and policy facing for leadership, institutional alignment, and creating campus strategies. And so I will hand it over to Jacqueline. She is a senior strategic consultant at Vantage with nearly 25 years of IT experience. She specializes in information security and technology infrastructure, particularly within higher education and research environments. With a background as CISO and senior infrastructure administrator at Reed College, Jacqueline has successfully tackled numerous complex InfoSec and networking projects. She is also a frequent speaker at conferences, such as EDUCAUSE and Internet 2, addressing a range of topics from zero trust network architecture to effective communication with institutional researchers. Over to you, Jacqueline.
Thanks for having me here today. And also happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month, now that it's October. So I've been asked to provide a brief background explaining where NSPM 33 came from, and it is indeed not a type of sun lotion. In recognition of the importance of research and development to the U.S. economy and national security interests, the Trump administration issued the National Security Presidential Memorandum, NSPM 33, in January of 2021, during the last week of that administration. In January of 2022, the Biden administration endorsed NSPM 33 and issued implementation guidance. Over a year later, in March of 2023, a request for information was issued for a public comment on proposed research security program standard requirements by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. And the comments were due by June 5th of last year. So on July 9th of this year, again, roughly a year later, the OSTP released their finalized guidelines for implementing a certification requirement imposed by NSPM-33 for research security programs at covered institutions. This standard requirement establishes basic parameters for the research security programs that covered institutions must have in place to continue competing for federal research grants. So that's the timeline up to today of NSPM-33 is to marshal a national effort to safeguard federally funded U.S. research and development activities. So NSPM-33 seeks to educate federal agencies and American researchers about research security risks and mitigate the threats posed by some foreign governments' efforts to steal American research or recruit American researchers. The goal of NSPM-33 are protection, clarity, and consistency. With protection, we mean to protect security while promoting openness in the research community. For clarity, we mean to make it clear so that well-intentioned researchers can easily and properly comply. And consistency, we mean to ensure that policies do not fuel xenophobia, prejudice, or discrimination. Among other requirements, NSPM-33 requires research institutions meeting certain funding requirements, including colleges and universities that receive more than $50 million per year in federal research funding to create a research security program. These programs need to have cybersecurity requirements that include components and suggested technical security controls that very much resemble NIST 800-171 as well as CMMC Level 1 requirements. However, they also need to include a proposed framework that addresses research security issues such as faculty conflicts of interest and commitment and research talent recruitment programs of foreign governments, with additional requirements around training on foreign travel security, cyber threat awareness and identification, and expert control guidance. It's noteworthy that the final standard requirement document released this summer do not base research cybersecurity program requirements on the FCI safeguards, as the earlier draft guidelines suggested may be the case. Instead, OSTP references a pending report on higher education research cybersecurity from NIST. This specific report we are currently waiting on is the NIST Report 8481, titled Cybersecurity for Research, Findings and Possible Paths Forward. With regards to the anticipated timeline moving forward, the memo from OSTP states that agencies will have 6 months from the date the July 9th memo was published to provide OSTP and the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, with their proposed implementation plans and the research security program guidelines. This lands around January of 2020. Once those agency plans are submitted, colleges and universities should be able to better understand what agencies' compliance regimes might look like. And agencies will then have another 6 months after that to implement their policies and processes, so mid-2025, with institutions getting up to 18 months from that point to ensure that they have compliant research security programs. And that deadline will be December of 2026. And of course, this is all waiting on the NIST final report, as institutions have 1 year following it being finalized to ensure that they have research cybersecurity programs and are consistent with, that's the terminology they use that is a little unclear, that report. So NIST could try to align the release of its final report to match OSTP's timeline for full institutional compliance, but that remains to be seen. So in my personal takeaway from the summer's finalized standard requirements, the principles for implementation of NSPM-33 are really that there is a focus on non-discrimination, so ensuring that research security requirements do not result in discrimination based on race, ethnicity, national origin, etc. Flexibility, so allowing institutions to structure the programs according to their needs and leverage existing programs where relevant. Certification mechanisms, so covered institutions must provide a written or electronic attestation to a federal research agency to certify compliance. And reducing administrative burden, so minimizing administrative burden on institutions and individuals, especially for less resourced institutions such as HBCUs and MSIs. That being said, this is still a large coordinated effort for institutions to meet involving like the Office of Research, Central IT, and other silos on campus that don't normally work together. So it will be interesting what efforts your campuses have been working on so far with the information we've been offered. So that was my entire intro. And I'm really interested in where this conversation is going to go at that point.
Great, thank you, Jacqueline. So to start off the conversation, we'll start with the data aspects of this conversation. Are there any burning questions right now that people want to start with? No questions. All right, I'll give you a question to start thinking on. So, and yes, since we have so many folks here today, let's use the hand raise reaction in Zoom. If you click the react icon, there will be a choice to raise your hand. But yeah, something to think about to get started is how it seems kind of you have to ponder how to achieve all of this security while also practicing open science and scholarship, which the institutions are also, or the federal departments are expecting too, the agencies. So that's just something that's been in my head. How do we kind of rectify these? And I don't think it's as hard as it sounds on the surface, right? Because generally in cybersecurity, you're not just concerned about the confidentiality of data. You're also concerned about things like integrity of that data. You don't want to get corrupted or accidentally deleted. And then availability. You also want the data and tools to be available for people to use and not like tied up in some thing like a CrowdStrike mistake. So. So here's a question then for what people are actually doing. How does your institution help provide services to like counter ransomware attacks like on laptops for researchers? Or is that mostly on the researcher to make sure that they are able to do that?
At Iowa State, there is security team that takes care of any security issues with personal equipment.
Laura?
So Jacqueline brought up a good point of the BYOD. For university-owned devices, then yes, our Office of Information Security does have services that they manage that, they respond to it, they help with the cleanup, etc. But for BYOD, the services are limited. And if our, meaning the university systems are, then yeah, we'll manage those, but BYOD, we can only give basic advice.
Alan Sill?
Thanks. having gone through a lot of NIST-related exercises before, many of us probably have, we have found largely that while these are useful exercises, they're often questions of documentation, and not so much that you change what you're doing, but you are required to document it perhaps better than you would normally. But in the large range of related topics that was mentioned by Jacqueline earlier, there are some substantive differences. The CMMC requirements are different than the NIST 800-171 requirements, and are different than the topic of this meeting. So I'm looking for what to tell my CIO that we have to do differently. I have told them basically that unlike some institutions on this list, we do not have compliant systems for CUI in place. And I'm looking for the substantive changes to our operations that we'll need. I already know what I'll need to do and I'm basically trying to get them to fund creating secure enclaves and so forth. I basically want to ask now what will be different to that list of substantive changes, not just documentation changes, but substantive changes that I need to prep the CIO for.
Laura?
So I would recommend having conversation, what amounts to a heart-to-heart with the CIO on what is the information security program you have, but moreover, what data classification do you have? What type of data do you have? Because that's going to impact what framework you use. If you don't know that, or if the CIO doesn't really have an answer on what program, then the place to start is the cybersecurity framework, just starting something. The cybersecurity framework is a great place to start if you don't have anything or you have a limited program, and then start classifying the data. The data classification, do you have HIPAA data? Do you have PII, PHI, PUI? All of that is going to really be the driver for where you go on what type of framework, what actions you need to do. But the cybersecurity framework has those actionable steps and also has a variety of different audience presentations that can really help get some of that buy-in.
Yeah, great answer. I would like to point out that that's a really good answer for people just getting started. I'm in a different situation in which we know what our framework is, and we know that we don't comply in certain areas. But what's changing, what I see is changing in the next year or so, is that entire classes of research grants are going to come with requirements that they never had before. And I know we're not prepared to meet without significant expenditures. Now, that being said, many institutions have made such things, and some great pioneering work done in the regulated research community of practice in general. I'm sorry, specifically that people should refer to add to the previous answer. But I just want to point out that all Department of Defense grants, all NIH grants are now asking us to treat stuff as controlled unclassified information by default, which is a huge paradigm shift and basically an unfunded mandate. And in my mind, a bad idea, but we don't get to debate that. It's going to be required. So I'm looking for that kind of answer. What should we all be aware that we need to go tell our CIOs, hey, all these people with NIH grants now have this new requirement. Somebody has to cough up some money and some staff to conform to these requirements.
For me, a big thing that helped was pulling my current and past 10-year status on those grants and saying, this is what we've had. This is what award dollars we've had. Now, you need to understand this is coming. These are the regulations. List them out. These are the approximate dates. We know things can change a little, but they're not going away. and then say, you need to understand, this is one, the regulations are not going away. Two, your researchers will not be able to obtain these grants if they don't have their enclaves. And then start simple and look at your options for how you can comply, where are your gaps. I would not recommend, if you haven't done a lot of work pulling in a third-party assessor for that gap assessment, but do your own self-assessment. If you're looking for a CUI with NIH and DoD, then do an internal self-assessment and see where your gaps are and start working there. The big thing for me was the money that we were going to see walk out the door if we did not get this enclave developed. The other thing you can consider is that NIST 800-171 overlaps a lot of the same regulations. They have similar controls to all the other stuff that we have to comply with, FERPA, and all the other regulations. So that can help your compliance across those frameworks as well.
So what techniques are people find effective in getting people to cough up the money?
So I just
Because
wanted
this
to,
is substantial work, right?
mhm. Yeah, I just wanted to provide a little context there. One is like trying to get a sense of what people are being asked for. I would talk to the contract units in your research administration departments. They're the ones who actually work with researchers when they are finalizing their grants. On all the terms in the contract, including these types of data clauses. So I'd be interested to see where in NIH they are asking for CUI though. I come from more of a clinical and health science background, and so far the requirements included in various CUI standards, they don't cover privacy at all, which is the biggest factor in any human related research. So I personally don't think it's possible for NIH to go down the 800-171 route. They're gonna have to create something of their own. Or just use HIPAA for everything, even though research isn't technically HIPAA. So yeah, I'd be interested to see any examples of NIH requiring CUI.
Right. So I put the link in the chat, and this is getting a discussion. If people haven't joined the Regulated Research Community Practice Slack, they have a really great Slack channel. I'll see if I can get a invite link. Higher Ed CUI, I think it's called. Let's see. Copy invite link. So here's that link, and people who know a lot more than I do are on that Slack. So I hope it's helpful. But just to point out, these are the things that I mentioned as, you know, beyond what the Jacqueline was covering initially. So I'm still looking to learn what the White House is going to require. But the NIH stuff and the CMMC, the Department of Defense stuff, has caught my attention. Em, are you trying to raise your hand?
Yes, in fact, yes, I am. I was distracted by Zoom offering to recognize my hand gestures. And so anyway, I'm curious because I usually sit pretty tightly in my little HPC cubbyhole. But our university is starting a review of security for HPC. And I don't want to spiral in, I want to spiral out a little bit. Case Western Reserve University is also, we're kind of ramping up our participation in a Midwestern research consortium. I don't remember the acronym and all that. I mean, a lot of you probably are familiar. The question that occurs to me is, in response to the fact that often these kind of government directives seem fairly punitive, right? And so do we have to struggle with it at the individual institution level? Is there, first off, I'm unfamiliar with the details, so maybe we have to, just by the language of the directive. But if we're not, or even if we are, can we still maybe find a way to emphasize the mutual support approach to particularly coping with costs, where costs are translated into effort? It takes effort, it takes time and effort to put systems in place. And so, that's my really vague, open-ended, hand-wavy kind of question as to where we are at this point in time. And, can we maybe get somewhere more comfortable than just kind of staring at this directive isolated in our own offices, on our own campuses? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's kind of what we were hoping to do with this call today, was to sort of see if folks had approaches that we're developing at their local institutions that they are willing to share. So we can kind of turn that around and throw that question open to the rest of the room. Are there folks who are, and we do want to shift to sort of a more systems position in just a few minutes, but are there folks who are starting to develop policies to respond to this, or are we all still in a place where we're trying to understand what expectations are still?
So I'm just jumping in to note that I put the link for the regulatedresearch.org site, and I think that is the community you were just asking about. Put that link in the chat.
And just a little context real quick. While regulated research community of practice is it's a great resource, it's also for regulated research. And there's a lot of research that doesn't have any special data requirements, but those are still going to be subject to this NSPM-33 as well. So that's kind of a big question for these data types that don't have very specific regulations like CUI or HIPAA. What are people doing for that? What do people think needs to be done that maybe they're not working on yet?
Right. So I was made aware recently by someone I know at the NIH that they have set up these cloud-based capabilities for doing data analysis. So I've been familiar with the NIH Data Commons for quite a while, and so it's under that umbrella. rights to the data commons. And so they've, I don't know how broadly they've publicized this. Okay, I just dropped the link in the chat. So they seem to have partnered with Google, with AWS, to offer a variety of services. So does this, in what way does this service, if any of our researchers take advantage, complicate the question? Because even if these services don't address, sensitive controlled data, there are others that do. We've operated at CASE, what we call a secure research environment, for quite a while. It's now under review as something that we might implement no longer ourselves, but through cloud resources. And I mean, we're evolving in that direction. So I guess that's another aspect of this compliance issue that, I mean, if nothing else, I'm bringing this back to my team now and saying, hey, look, there's stuff you guys probably knew I didn't know, and it's time to maybe grapple with it.
Carolyn put a comment in the chat here. I do agree with Deb. The biggest group less than prepared for NSPM 33 is going to be our fundamental researchers. To them, other than bring your own device, they might not actually notice these additional security requirements. And there's another question here. Who is going to be owning the creation and maintenance of the research security program? And how will the institution make sure to include all research under this program?
Well, that last part is a really great question. So I just want to preface that by saying what I think a lot of people on this call already know, and Lauren in particular has been great about promoting, which is we know that the HPC envelope has expanded over many years to include a wide variety of research, academic research, computing, classroom instruction. And now with the advent of AI, practically everybody wants a computing resource, someone in almost every department. So as the mission of academic research computing grows, throwing these extra requirements on, I just want to point out NIH is saying CUI for all genomics data. DoD is saying CUI for all DoD funded grants. That's probably a 40% of your funding profile right there. So I think this is something that we all need to wake up to. And I've personally been on a mission to improve my contacts and relationships with the security team, make sure that we're operating as one team, and to raise these funding questions, as I said earlier. If we're going to be required to build secure enclaves, if it's not just going to be the institutions that have classified research, then this is a wake-up call that I don't think has penetrated institutional management up to the levels that it needs to. And this stuff is going to be required, like in months. So it's something that you need to pay attention to.
So regarding NIH, so looking at this document that you put in the chat, I think this is specific to if you are trying to get genomic data from an existing NIH database. I don't think it's if you're generating your own genomic data. So like dbGaP is the one we see the most often. Basically, if you're going to get the controlled dbGaP data, it's now going to require like 2E levels. I don't think it's as large as people think it is regarding the NIH. But yeah, personally, I would definitely love to get a more firm answer on that, because right, I'm just skimming this document right now. Does anyone happen to have better insight on NIH or have contacts who might?
At CASC, there was a talk a couple of CASC meetings ago by someone. Perhaps we could look up who that was. I'll see if I can find it in the previous agenda, so we'll at least have a name.
I mean, I can say for dbGaP at least, here at Vanderbilt, we've focused on just leaning into NIST 800-171 to cover that, because that seems to be the request there. So, and I came from NIH actually prior to this, and I know there was a lot of conversation at the time of even for our own internal researchers there saying, what do we require? And us not knowing there internally, much less being able to disseminate out to all the many of us who depend on NIH funding. So I don't know that there is a super clear answer from the NIH front, but at least with dbGaP, the answer seems to be just lean into NIST 800-171.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think NIH has the largest amount of research funding, right? Like they fund the most national researchers. I think it's NIH. All right, Alan, yes, I see in the chat. Laura Biven from NIH. I will see about contacting her and maybe asking for a little more clarity. And maybe it's possible that we, as a community, still have some collaboration we could do with NIH on making this clearer. Because quite frankly, I've looked at 800-171 and also 853 and compared it to HIPAA, and they're not quite one-to-one. So you can't always guarantee that you're going to be HIPAA aligned when you are meeting 853. So I think that's a key point that a lot of people miss. And really don't want NIH to miss that.
Deb, there's a question in the chat from J.R. Scott on the topic of who will work with or at schools. Is anybody working with their library? Carnegie Mellon University is doing some advising of researchers with data from a group within the library. So I guess is anybody else, is that initiative in the library?
So I found the library to be a wonderful resource to train people in data management plans for writing research grants. They actually seem to just take that as part of their mission, and they developed a whole training program. And I just point people to that when they ask me for contributions to their proposals. Usually they want to write up of our equipment or something, but for the data management plan, the library has been a wonderful partner. I don't think that they're equipped to handle these regulatory requirements, but I could be wrong. Certainly there should be a conversation, I think.
Yeah, this is Ray Scott. That was my question. One of the things I'm finding is, yeah, I mean, we have a pretty active security group, so they're working on the compliance side of it. But then the gap that I was seeing was if a researcher then has data that's a result of some of this work of their research, and then that has to be preserved. Just the thing that libraries do well, which is indexing and archiving and preservation, and then making sure that if there was a requirement that requirement stays through the life of the data. So that was a little niche that I saw them falling into. You know, in fact, the first that I heard about this presidential memo was from our people in the library.
Thanks for the shout out to libraries. I think it's probably going to depend just on how these groups are structured, but I would also be referring people to our Office of Research for the compliance parts of things. So Laura has her hand up.
Hi, I'm a research data management librarian, and actually this information is new to me, so I'm still taking it in. But I have to say, as a research data management librarian, I would want to be aware of how this affects especially storage systems, because we're not experts on storage, but we try to help refer people or help people understand what storage options they might want to use, or, how to store their data and be compliant. So I can see possibly some connection with storage here. And I'm also just looking at all the links that everybody sent, and I find it interesting because there's been talk about disclosure requirements and standardization, research security programs, cyber security, foreign travel, and so on. But then stuck in there is digital persistent identifiers, which I don't advise people on, but we have an institutional repository with a librarian who mints digital persistent identifiers. And I guess I was also wondering what that really has to do with cybersecurity. I tend to associate it with preservation, but those are just the thoughts I wanted to share with you. Thanks.
Dory?
Hi, I'm Dory Sidock from the University of Buffalo. I'm on the systems facing steering committee, and one of the things that we were curious about when we first got the request to team up with you guys this month, and it definitely dovetails from what Laura was just saying. Most of us were not familiar with this memo. And so when we Googled it, we saw a handful of universities that already had outward facing policies, or at least policy plans. So like Emory, University of Rochester, Georgia Tech, I think University of Georgia. And so I was just curious if if there are any system administrators from any organizations that already have these policies in place, and if you've been asked to implement them on the system side. What it looks like to me is that the majority of universities that have a policy, that policy is coming from their Office of Research or, VPR's office. But to me, when you start talking about cybersecurity and individual devices and storage systems, you're talking about university-wide policies that generally are going to come from the Office of Security or whatever you happen to call yours. So I was just curious. I happen to work for a center that is outside of the main IT department that provides HPC. And so I was just curious if there were any system administrators or system staff that had is already trying to work on this.
Well, at the risk of being repetitive, I think that's what we identified earlier as that regulated research community of practice that I think originated out of CASC and formed its own group, but a very friendly, welcoming group it is. To try to give a slightly more useful answer, I think there have been some attempts at some outfits for comprehensive solutions, preemptive. TAC has, for example, announced that it's going to run all of its storage systems as CUI. It's been only a few years since I reverted the default for our cluster file systems from readable by everyone to readable only by the account owner. We had people coming on who were young enough to regard the fact that other people could read their files as a security problem. Those of us who grew up building clusters and sharing them with each other, read by everyone was the default. So there have been some changes of practice. And so, as I said, TAC is trying to treat all of its storage systems as CUI, which just neatly encapsulates those requirements. But I'm not sure what's involved in that. Do any other institutions on this call have those sorts of plans? Does sound like it. And as I said, when I looked at it, I realized that it required a comprehensive approach. So I'm kind of waiting for the guidelines to settle down. And what I fear is that we're going to get 3 different sets of guidelines and multiple sets of guidelines from different agencies. NIH struck me as particularly blunderbuss, kind of broad requirement. We've seen NSF actually retract its guidance on related topics. For example, they wanted us to treat all review materials as CUI. Sensible sounding requirement, but if you think about the implications on university data storage systems, that becomes a nightmare, and so they quickly withdrew it. So, Jacqueline, you gave us the introduction. What's been your impression about the chances for any kind of coherence? This process that you described sounds like it's intended to establish coherence and give institutions time to respond. Do we have any insight into how well that's going?
So I normally work with client institutions with the IT departments or with the information security departments, and I'm those departments to reach out to research and actually start the conversation. Somebody needs to actually cross over to the other silo and start the conversation to create a comprehensive program that's going to stretch across the institution, and that's going to have to include some sort of communication plan to reach all of the fundamental research that is not normally worrying about anything like this. And where some institutions are thinking about, let's just make everything CUI, or let's just put everything in an enclave, that's not going to work. That's not going to scale. And that nobody has the money for that, to put fundamental research into that kind of protection. So it really is going to be using the existing systems that are out there, educating. And I mean, the self-certification, that's going to be, you're going to have to recertify every year that you're compliant. And as mentioned, this compliance and self-attestation, it's becoming more and more of like punitive thing. Like you do not want to get that wrong. So I think taking it seriously and actually starting a coordinated effort across your institution, maybe getting the leadership of the room and talking about it really quickly as to like, we need a RACI diagram. We need to know who's owning each of these things, and we need to have like a deadline and milestones and treat it like an actual project. There might be a lot of things in place in your institution that actually checks a lot of the boxes already. And you're going to have to document it and get that published as your, your research, your security research program. That being said, it's going to be work. I mean, like somebody has to put it together, and somebody has to collect it, and somebody has to publish it. And that has to be maintained. So like making this a priority for your institution, it's just going to take actually getting it on people's radars. And I think that's my main guidance that I would suggest, is like, just go start having conversations with other departments about it, and see if there's like a monthly meeting you can put together to talk about where things are and who owns what.
Sounds like good advice. Our particular VPR spends most of his time ducking these things, but I think we might have found one that he can't duck. Well, we're near the top of the hour.
Yes, we are. I was just about to mention that. So thank you everyone for coming. So the call document will stay publicly available, view only, and we will put all the chat, all the questions, everything in there as a reference for later. We will also be uploading the recording to the CARC YouTube, which is youtube.com/CARC, CARCC. So thank you all for coming. This was a great conversation. Sounds like we need to have another one though. So we shall see you all next month.
Thanks.
Thank you.